Thank you, Clint, for another wonderful concert. And for those of you that are here, you know how great it is to come early and hear Clint lead off. And so please come. He'll be here next time too. So come early and share with your friends. Okay, so share with your friends. That'd be great. So let me give you a little background on next chapter. This is, I think, about our 10th presentation. And the whole goal of next chapter is to help people transition successfully from one chapter of their lives to another. And we all go through a lot of chapters, from retirement, loss of a spouse or loved one, and many others. So we want your feedback on that for what you'd like to hear for speakers. I got a pretty good idea today that I wanted to run by some people, that we could do a program next fall for technology for seniors or technology for dummies. What's that? Right. I spent about an hour and a half today trying to get the senior sneakers card. Somebody told me about it, and I said, well, you know, a guy like me, I could maybe stand to be in a little better shape. So on I went to the wide world, and an hour and a half later, after talking to every Medicare provider in North America, I finally found somebody that could help me. And I got my card a little bit later for Jim Zimberman. And so hopefully that'll work. But again, if you're like me and you don't have access to a 10-year-old, it's pretty darn hard to find your way around. So we'll think about that. So let me give you a little bit of ground rules. So tonight, Ross, our speaker, will speak, and after that there'll be a Q&A. And if you didn't get a handout coming in, grab one on the way out. It's from Ross. And again, go to our website if you would, and tell us what you're thinking, what you'd like to see. We'll be planning the fall schedule this summer. So June 8th is our last presentation for this season, and that'll be Chris Thibodeau, who's really a fascinating guy. You're really going to want to come to hear Chris. So Chris has got quite an extraordinary background. Hugely successful in pharma sales and marketing. Decided to go on his own when he was in his late 40s. Started a consulting and coaching business. Some of his clients are the NFL, United Healthcare, and others like that. He's the chaplain for the Timberwolves, and that's got to be a tough job. You know, they need a lot of prayer. So he does that, and not too long ago, his dad called and said, Chris, I need you to take over the family business. And he said, oh my gosh, I just started my own business. He said, well, I need you to pray about it and think about it. So now Chris is the senior pastor of a church in North Minneapolis that is just on fire. So they get 70 people every Saturday for their men's group, more for their women's group. They got a 24-hour crisis center. So he's a cool guy, and you will want to hear Chris. So come for that if you would. And now John Hallberg, who is part of our team and is responsible for inviting our speaker tonight, is going to introduce him.
Great, Jim. Thank you. And good evening, everybody. Great to see you here. So Ross Levin is the co-founder of Accredited Investors Wealth Management, a 60-person comprehensive wealth management firm which helps clients better align their money and values. And I can say Renee and I have been working with Accredited for a number of years, and I will say they live that mission absolutely positively. And so it's been a pleasure for us to work with Ross and his team. He has a twice monthly, you may have seen him, he's got a twice monthly Star Tribune column writing on money and values. I'll say more about that in just a second. And he's also written three books. He was named by Financial Planning magazine as one of the 5 most influential people in financial planning and received their first Lifetime Achievement Award. He's appeared in or on NPR, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Oprah. He's active at his alma mater, the University of Minnesota, and actually Ross and my wife Renee attended the U at the same time, roughly, and he was former chair of the University of Minnesota Foundation and still serves on that board. He's been married for 40 years to his lovely wife Bridget, who's also with us this evening, and they have 30-year-old twin daughters. And as I said, in his article this past Sunday, yeah, I still read it the old-fashioned way, the print way. Ross had some great sound bites in there about the benefits of charitable giving, and a couple that really resonated with me were: giving is believing that you are a beneficiary of the good works of others. That just really clicked, because I've heard that here from the pulpit many times in other places. And perhaps even more importantly, giving connects you to something outside yourself. So with that, please join me in welcoming Ross to our next chapter ministry.
Thank you. Hey, John, did you grab my index cards by chance?
What's that?
Did you grab my index cards
No,
that I had?
I did not.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. How are you? Thank you for coming. It's to come in the middle of the week to hear about money is a challenge. I appreciate you being here. We're not going to really talk about money, though, that much. We're going to talk about some of the things that money generates in all of us, and some of the things that we deal with when we're talking about money. But first of all, I want to thank John for the introduction. My wife Bridget is sitting right here, and as John mentioned, we're going to be celebrating our 40th anniversary in June. And then one of my partners, Becky, is sitting next to Bridget. Becky's the co-managing partner of our firm, and she took over that role from my founding partner and me last March. So we're in our own transition. We're still very active in the field, but I'm no longer running the company, which is very different thing. And I'm learning how to be a good, what would you call me? Oh, don't answer that. Okay. Anyway, money is an odd thing, and it's a challenging thing, and it can mess us up quite a bit. Let me ask you, how many of you feel like you have a completely perfect relationship with money? Oh God, my wife raised her hand, which let me just vouch against that. So yeah, money's a very confusing thing for all of us. It means different things to each of us. And I think money in transitions is even more complicated because we're going through changes in our lives. And remember, transitions are simply the end of something, this long period of disequilibrium where we're not quite sure what's next, and then the start of something. And it's that period of disequilibrium where we're in the middle and we're trying to understand where we are and what's going to happen next, where sometimes we react in ways that might not be the most beneficial, actually, to moving forward. So tonight I'm going to cover three things. I'm going to talk about, first, what are the internal money discussions that we have? Second, what do others tell us about money and whether we should listen to it or not? And three, how can we put money in its proper place in our lives? And so, John mentioned that Renee and I were students at the University of Minnesota, and that was many years ago. And did any of you go to the university? Okay, some of you did. I don't know if you remember that back then there used to be these huge auditorium classes where sometimes there'd be 1,000 or 1,500 kids in a particular class, and there was a class that I took at the U that was called Religious Studies, and I remember that distinctly, and it was one of those auditorium classes. There were probably 1,000 or 1,200 kids in the class, and I took that class not because I was particularly religious, but I took it because for the last several years the teacher had set up an agenda where there was no attendance requirement, there were no midterms, there were no pop quizzes, and the only thing you had to do was answer the question at the end of the school year, and the question was simply describe the wanderings and the teachings of the Apostle Paul. So, a lot of people in my fraternity took it because we weren't necessarily rocket scientists, but we took that class and we were really interested in it. We studied everything there was to know about the wanderings and the teachings of the Apostle Paul. And by the time we got ready to take the test. We went into the room for the final exam, and they passed out these test booklets. And we got there a little bit late, and we were sitting in the back of the room, and I'll never forget the tension in the room was completely palpable. It was unbelievable that people were sweating. You could see people were like frustrated. They were closing their test booklets and just sitting there looking around, and I didn't know what was going on. I opened up my test booklet, and the question was, criticize the Sermon on the Mount. And I looked at myself and I said, oh no, what do I know about the Sermon on the Mount? I know nothing about the Sermon on the Mount. I sat there for probably 10 minutes just dumbfounded. By the time I got up, I just wrote a couple things, but I really didn't know what I was writing. By the time I got up to the front of the room to drop off my test booklet, most of the room had left, except one of my fraternity brothers who was sitting by me, and he was writing furiously. And I couldn't believe it. And this was probably one of the most shocking things in my life. This was not a very good student, and he was just writing. Sweat was pouring off his head. He was writing unbelievably fast, and I didn't know what was going on. A week later, I went to pick up the test booklet, my test booklet, and there was a big pile of them, and most of them had Fs, and then there was his test booklet that was sitting right there, and this was before I had any kind of ethics requirement, so I grabbed his test booklet, and I opened it up, and it said, who am I to criticize the Sermon on the Mount? What I'd really like to talk about are the wanderings and the teachings of the Apostle Paul. And I think about that when we think about how we deal with money. A lot of times we change the subject from the subject of money to something that we're more comfortable talking about. And money really is not this real thing. All money is our portrayal of something else. And so sometimes money's power, sometimes money is love, sometimes money is many things, but it's really not money. My own transition, as I described, has been a challenging one for me, and I would say it's challenging in the sense that I am trying to define myself in a new role, and when I'm in this role, I have three things I think about all the time. One is, where do I step in? Where do I step up? And where do I step out? And for some of you, I know that in fact, I was talking to John earlier about this, where you have a new ministry, a relatively new ministry team, and you have a senior minister who's been here for a long time, who still is actively involved. And sometimes that can be a challenge because if the senior minister casts a big shadow, it can be hard for the new ministry team to, do what they do best. And so that's one of the things that I'm very, very conscious of. So again, because I have this disequilibrium stage here where I'm not retiring, I'm still very active in the business, but I'm in a new phase. I'm trying to sort through what is next for me and what that's going to look like. And one of the things, are you familiar with Richard Rohr? Do you know Richard Rohr at all? Yeah, he's one of my favorites. He's a Jesuit priest, and I said Franciscan priest. You're right. Thank you. And I subscribe to his daily meditations. But one of the things, by coincidence, it came a couple weeks ago, it was about transitions. And he said, liminality is a form of holding the tension between one space and another. It's in these transitional moments of our lives that authentic transformation can happen. Otherwise, it is just business as usual, an externally boring status quo existence. And when I think about the place that I'm in, this is a huge opportunity to transform myself into something different. And we are always in transition. I mean, Jim mentioned things like divorce or death or those kind of things. But, Bridget and I have been married 40 years, and we've probably had 8 marriages in those 40 years. We had a marriage before we had kids. We had a marriage before we started our businesses. We had a marriage, when our kids were young. We had a marriage when our kids went to college. We had a marriage now that we're going to be grandparents. All of these, you didn't know that, Julie. All of these things have happened, and it's each one has been a transition for us. So a lot of times we don't necessarily recognize the transitions that we're going through, but every transition, even if it's for just a few minutes, causes this disequilibrium. And my hope is that when you think about money is one of the things that I think causes us some of the most unsettling in our lives, because we are making choices and making decisions all the time about money, and it always has an effect on us. And sometimes the effect is, in a moment, and sometimes it's a big effect. We bought a house we didn't want to live in. We bought a house that we're excited about. All of these different kinds of things are essentially transitions that we have to work through. I want to say that there's some other things to think about from a transition standpoint. How many of you are recently retired? Some of you? Okay. So you moved from a saving place to a spending place. That's a very hard transition. It's one of the hardest things that our clients experience, is especially the ones that were really good accumulators. Once they're forced to live off their assets, it's a totally different switch, and many of them have a really hard time with that. And so that's one of the things that it's a transition that I don't know that we pay close attention to. Debt changing, that's a transition that happens all the time. And renting to owning to renting again. Many of us go through these different types of transitions. So what I'm going to talk about is, what do we tell ourselves about money? And how does money influence our other behavior? One of the things I think we tell ourselves is that money makes us happy. And there's a lot of research that shows that that's actually not the case. In fact, it says, as long as you're above subsistence or above a certain level of comfort, extra incremental money does not make us happier. Now, I will tell you, I don't know that that's true. And from experience, I will say that money doesn't buy happiness, but it allows us to pay for some things that can create enjoyment. But money for sure does not make us happy. And one of the ways I think that you can kind of look at what you need, I would say that one of the ways we think about it is, what you need is just below what your ego wants. Okay, so if you think about it, many of us have lived in different stages of life. Some of us have had more money at different times and less money at different times. But really, a lot of our money decisions are a reflection of ego. And I think that how we relate to what happens with our money has a much more powerful impact on us than the money ourselves. We were working with a developer back in 2008. He was a real estate developer in Chicago, a very successful developer. And then he had built a couple spec homes back in 2008. Do you remember what happened in 2008? Yeah, it was bad. I was in a fetal position most of that year. And the spec homes didn't work, and so he ended up filing for bankruptcy, and his wife was involved in the business, and he was involved in the business. And I remember what he was experiencing through that time, and what we were trying to do was figure out how he could save his house. That was going to be his touchstone. For him, that was the most important thing, just to have the place that he had built for he and his wife, and he wanted to be comfortable there. So we spent a lot of time working on that. He spent probably 3 or 4 years fighting through all of these different issues, and he wanted to make as many people whole as he could, and he wanted to save his house. And ultimately he did. And he never got back on track professionally. So remember, this was 2008, so he decided about himself that he never wanted to put himself in that position again. And so what did he do? He chose to modify his lifestyle dramatically. And as a result of that, he has a lot more freedom, a lot more flexibility. He went from 40 employees to no employees. And if you ask him, is he happier today than he was then? It's a counterfactual, it's hard to know, but he is more comfortable today than he is then. If you see him, he's a different person. But another thing happened to him, and I think it's really an important kind of a second, I would say, transition. He and his wife lost a child. And the way they lost their child was the child was using a recreational drug, and he got a bad batch of whatever the drug was, and he ended up dying by jumping off of a roof. And this person, he and his wife, devoted their energy now to starting a not-for-profit that deals with recreational drugs. So these are two terrible things. I can't, if any of you have lost a child, there's probably nothing worse in the world than losing a child and filing for bankruptcy. And yet he and his wife turned his life around. We always say when bad things happen, you can either turn on each other or turn to each other. and they chose to turn to each other. And the money was secondary to everything that they did in their lives in order to make their vision for what their future was going to look like. And they did have a vision for themselves, and I think that was a really important thing. The things we do with our money that align with our values is what make us happy. And you hear a lot that you should spend your money on experiences and not things. Well, that's not necessarily true. I think it's true that experiences last longer than things. But again, it's what your values are. I know some people who love cars. They just love cars. If they choose to spend money on cars, that's their value. Okay, it might not be my value, it might not be their value, but some of the things, if you're doing something for yourself that makes you happy, or if you're doing something for others that makes them happy, then you're probably aligned. But I would not sit in judgment of how anyone spends their money, because you just don't know what their lives are like. It's interesting how we make choices, though, around what makes us happy. Bridget and I go to Arizona in the winter, and we rented for 10 years in Arizona, trying to figure out where we wanted to be, and I can still work remotely, so it doesn't affect our business. And we finally ended up buying a place a year ago, and I remember the conversations that we had around that. We created a list of the things that were really important for us that we thought that we wanted to have, and I kept kind of pushing against that list a little bit. And what I mean by that was that, we would say, okay, we want to be close to nature, or we want to be, we want to have a house that the kids will want to come to. But then I started thinking, like, well, maybe we want to entertain here. Maybe we want to have a University of Minnesota event here. I started kind of expanding what it was we wanted, and none of that was for me. It was for an impression that I wanted to end up giving. And that is long term, that's a very unhealthy thing to do, because impressions change all the time. And as most of the time in our marriage, Bridget kind of gave me some good counsel as to why we should think differently. And we ended up buying, I think, a place that is going to be much more fitting for us. But even I was wrestling with, am I doing this for my own values, or am I doing this to show others what is possible? I will also say that one of the things that we encourage many of our clients to do is to spend more. Most people often will die with more than what they need, and you're going to do two things with your money. You're going to either spend it or you're going to give it away. Those are the only two choices you have. And so the question becomes, are you spending it while you're alive in ways that you want, or are you giving it away while you're alive in ways that you want, or are you kind of holding tight to it out of insecurity or fear or whatever? So I remember we're talking to one client a lot, and he was spending a very small amount of his portfolio. And I kept talking to him about, have you thought about doing this? Have you thought about doing that? And one of the things he said to me that I thought was really powerful was he finally looked at me and he said, you know what? I'm just really comfortable with where I'm at. And I realized that I was pushing him into areas that I didn't need to be pushing him. He was completely comfortable. So if you are comfortable, that's great. But if you're uncomfortable, explore that. I think another thing that we hear about money is that money makes us secure. And money does not make us secure. That's one of the biggest fallacies I think that we have about money. And the reason I say that is that I remember probably 15 years ago, there was a book that was called The Number. And the premise of the book was, once everyone has a number in their head, and once they hit a particular number, then they'll be financially secure. But think how silly that is. Okay, think what that means. That means then that your focus becomes that number. And if the markets go up, you feel good. If the markets go down, you feel bad. You've taken what you want that money to do for you completely out of the picture and are focusing on this inanimate thing that is really meaningless. The only way we feel secure is when we feel secure. And that's a personal thing that we have to work on by being aware of the times that we feel insecure and challenging those things. Our two most difficult clients are the clients that spend too much money, and that's obvious, but it's also the clients that save too much money. Money has a power over each of them that is unhealthy. Their relationship with money is not a sound one. And for all of us, how we handle our money makes a huge difference in other aspects of our life. One of the things that I would ask myself, and I encourage you to think about it, is what do you tell yourself about money that leaves you to feel insecure? What is it? And I would ask you whether that insecurity comes from an attachment to something. And if that attachment exists, then I ask you to explore what is that you're attached to and why are you attached to it. And I think that attachment is a challenge because the one thing we know about life is that it changes constantly. I can promise you impermanence. That's all I can promise you. And impermanence is a hard thing to deal with because it acknowledges that we don't have control over the things that we hope to have control over. And I think one of the challenges that many of us have around money is because we become unnecessarily attached to something that we don't really need. There was a great minister named Forrest Church, and he said, religion is the human response to being alive and having to die. And that's kind of all what we're dealing with. We're trying to live the life we want while we recognize that at some point that life is going to be taken from us. And so what you choose to do and the actions that you take around that big issue will influence your friendships, your interaction, your partnerships, and every aspect of your life. I think one of the things that we often say to ourselves is, if I had this, then I would feel this. And we convince ourselves that this will solve a problem, this will create happiness, this will do something. I don't know how many of you have experienced really wanting something, finally getting it, and then either becoming habituated to it, where you're just, it suddenly doesn't mean anything to you, or realizing that that's not what you really wanted. We see that a lot with clients who change jobs. They change a job because they think they're not being appreciated at work. They go someplace else, and then they end up realizing they're not being appreciated at that place. And then ultimately, maybe they weren't being appreciated at work, or maybe it was their own feelings of inadequacy that forced them to do that. So one of the things, again, when you're dealing with all of these things, we're trying to get to the root cause of what the issues are, because if we understand the root cause, that solves a lot of the problems. There's this endowment effect that we have with money when we talk about money making us feel secure. How many of you have things in your house that you wouldn't buy today? Yeah, right? But we don't give them away either. We know we wouldn't buy them, but we're stuck keeping them. Well, that's an endowment effect, and that endowment effect happens in all aspects of our life. It happens when we don't spend money that we want to spend. It happens, you can call it a sunk cost. If we buy, a ticket to a show and we lose the ticket, we tend to not repeat. We won't buy another ticket because we lost it, and we feel bad about paying twice for something. So we create these artificial rules that impact how we look at the world. And those artificial rules, why would we make ourselves prisoners of our own device? We do that all the time, and it's because what we tell ourselves about money. There's a concept in Buddhism called near enemies, and it's one of my favorite concepts. And what it talks about, near enemies, is a quality that we look at that we think may be helpful, but it's actually something that gets in our way. And in Buddhism, they talk about there's four things called the four immeasurables, and those are four traits. And so loving kindness, for example, is one of those traits. And everyone knows what the opposite of loving kindness is. The opposite of loving kindness would be ill will, right? Instead of loving everyone, you want what's bad for everyone. But the near enemy of loving kindness is attachment. And so think about if you've been in a relationship where you love the person that you're involved with, but then all of a sudden you have, you want to control them, or you want to do things that are not necessarily healthy for the relationship. That's the near enemy. That's attachment. Appreciative joy is another trait that is one of the four immeasurables. Obviously, the opposite, appreciative joy, is being happy for the good fortune of others. And it's one of the things that we really try to encourage. We try to encourage we have twin daughters, and if you've ever had twins, competitiveness can be kind of sort of a feature of twindom. And we try to really help them be appreciative of each other's good fortune, and I would say we're only occasionally successful with that. But appreciative joy, the opposite of appreciative joy is jealousy, but the near enemy of appreciative joy is hypocrisy, when you pretend you're happy for someone, but you really aren't. And compassion, the opposite is cruelty, but the near enemy is pity. And I think a lot about that with charity. When are we really being compassionate, or are we pitying those that we're supporting? Because pity makes people less than us instead of our equals. And then equanimity, the opposite is hatred, but the near enemy is indifference. And that's one of the hardest things to combat. Hatred's obvious, but the near enemy's much more challenging. Well, in money, security is the trait that we might be clamoring for, and the opposite of security is greed, is being a spendthrift. But the near enemy is greed. We hold on to things in a way that we think makes us secure, but it actually makes us less secure. One of the things with money I think that we tend to do is the trait is explanation. When we explain what's going on with ourselves, well, the near enemy for explanation is excuses. The far enemy is avoidance. We don't even pay attention. But excuses, we've got clients where we'll say this is what a safe spending amount is, and every year they spend more than what that safe spending amount is, because every year something comes up that they knew, that they weren't prepared for, and ultimately what they're doing is making excuses rather than kind of accepting this is where we're at. I think that the other piece that we see from a trait that becomes a near and a far enemy, thriftiness can be a good trait. Being conscious of what you're spending and how you're spending it. Frugality is not a good trait, and parsimony is not a good trait. And so how do you kind of be aware of when you're stepping into these near enemies and these far enemies in such a way that they become unproductive for you? I think another thing that we tell ourselves, at least I've heard, and sometimes I tell myself, is I just want you to know, when I said everyone's messed up about money, I'm messed up about money too, and I'm an expert, so it's a hard thing to deal with. Money's trade-offs are worth it. That's one of the things that we're constantly saying. If I'm working really hard because I want to support the family, or I'm doing this because of this. Well, one of the things I was talking to one of our clients who was a physician, and he loved practicing medicine, loved it, and he was in his 60s, but he hated taking call, right? So I said to him, how long would you practice if you didn't have to take call? And he said, well, I'd practice forever. I love what I'm doing. I said, well, why don't you sell your call to your group? Why don't you just essentially give up call and take less money? Oh, I can't do that. That wouldn't be fair to me. It would cost me too much to do that. Well, suddenly he transferred what was going to make him happy into a fairness argument. Why did that apply? That had nothing to do with what he could have done in order to stay doing what he loved doing. We get ourselves tied up in knots, I think, in ways that we forget what the trade-offs are. We're all bartering every day for money. We're either spending it, we're earning it, but we're bartering every day. When we take time off, we're bartering. We could be working. When we're working, we could be taking time off. So the question is just how do you get more conscious of those trade-offs? How do you get more conscious of the bartering? No, nothing is good or bad as it relates to that, as long as it's connected to what you want for yourself. I mean, you have to really explore that. And again, when you think about what you need in order to be able to retire, or what you need in order to live a good life in retirement, there's three things that are important for how long you need your money to last. The most important is how many years you're going to be needing to spend off of your portfolio. So if you retire at 50, you obviously need a lot more money than if you retire at 90, right? So that's the most important thing. The second most important thing is how much you want to leave to either someone or to legacy. Okay, that's the second most important thing. The third most important thing is how the money's invested. But everyone spends all their time focused on how the money's invested and not thinking about those other things and what they actually can represent to you. And then another way of thinking about it, one of our clients was a retired lawyer, and what he's doing, they've got enough resources to be able to retire, but what he's doing right now is he's a starter at Braemar Golf Course. And why is he doing that? He's not doing it because he needs the money. He's doing it because he wants the social interaction, and he wants to be able to do things that, for him, get him out of the house, and that's a trade-off that's worth it. Now, I look at him, and I love that about him, and I say to myself, would I have the guts to do that? And I would have to say, would I be embarrassed if someone saw me as a starter? Would I have to explain why I'm a starter? He doesn't think of any of that. He's got a much healthier relationship with where he's at than I would in that situation. I have a daily practice, and the reason I talk about this awareness piece is I have a daily practice, and I've had it for years. And I do basically three things, and it's really helped me, I think, with some of the things that I think about. One is I meditate. Are any of you meditators? Okay, I have a few of you. So I spend a certain amount of time each day meditating, and I meditate on those four immeasurables, but I also kind of work through when I meditate things that had happened for the previous day. You're supposed to focus on your breath. I don't do that. I kind of think through the things that might have happened the previous day, things that went well or things that didn't go well. But I don't judge them. I think what meditation does for me is makes me aware of them without judgment. Because what happened, I don't need to judge whether I was good or bad. I just need to judge whether that behavior, or I need to be aware of whether I want to repeat that behavior or not, and make choices about that. We had a meeting, and we were talking in our business. We were talking about, we have this kind of continuous improvement philosophy in our business. We always want to try to get better. Well, one of the problems with that is that it can appear negative, because you're always saying, oh, we could do this differently, or we could do that differently, or how do we do that? But it's really not a negative thing. You can be critical without being negative. And I think one of the things to explore for yourself is, how do you spend more time being intentional? My daily practice also includes spiritual reading and journaling. So before I open an email, I am spending probably, including walking the dog, I'm probably spending 40 minutes inoculating myself from what's going to come my way. And what that has done for me has made me much better able to handle anything that happens later on. Before I did that, I used to open my emails first, and right away that would, determine what my day was going to look like. So I encourage you again, what is it that you can do to help you become more aware, help you become more in touch, and how do you explore that? There's an author, Wendell Berry, and he said this, and I thought this was really profound. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we've come to our real work, and that when we no longer know which way to go, we've begun our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. Most of us spend a lot of our life on autopilot, and a lot of us are afraid of this disequilibrium stage. And I encourage you, I really encourage you to, when you feel unsettled, sit with it. Don't run from it. Sit with it. Because that is what's going to help you make better decisions, whether it's related to money or whether it's related to other things. We ask ourselves, Britt and I ask ourselves, what do we want more of, what do we want less of, and what are the new set of trade-offs that we're willing to accept. And it's, again, the stage that I'm going through. Bridget's going through it as well. She's had a business for many years, and it's, again, how do we orchestrate this together, and what are we willing to do, and what are we willing to not do? The other thing I think that we say to ourselves is that once I have this, then this will happen. And I'll never forget, I had one of our clients, his wife got Alzheimer's when she was 65, and he took care of her for 10 years, very, very close care, and she got gradually worse and worse until she passed away. But I'll never forget him saying, as he would bring her in, and he'd bring her in to the meetings and stuff, I forget him saying, if this happens to me, I'm not going to let this happen to me. I will do something to make sure that this doesn't happen to me. Well, it started happening to him, and he never noticed that it happened to him. I don't know if you know people that have it. Sometimes they're not necessarily aware of it. And so he then spent the next 10 years with Alzheimer's after she passed. So literally she passed away, and he started his own Alzheimer's journey, and his kids were very involved. And I remember what they said to us once was that when they were getting close to retiring, they said, we're thinking about giving our kids some money as a way to, kind of help them out. And we had a conversation, and I said, what if you brought all the kids on a family trip and had just a great family trip together before you ended up retiring? What would that feel like? Would you think that and they worked it through, and they ended up doing that. They ended up renting a house someplace, and all the kids came together. These kids got along with each other, which is not always the case. And they had a fantastic family experience with kids and grandkids and everyone in the house. And then she came down with Alzheimer's probably 2 years later, and they would never have been able to do that. And so one of the things that I want you to ask yourself is, what are you waiting for? Okay, some things we don't know when the transition, sometimes we can plan our transitions, but often we can't. So what is it that you're waiting for? NPR recently asked me, I was on Angela Davis's show, and then she asked me, what's the best financial advice I can give? And I said, want what you have. And the reason why is, as long as you want what you have, no one can take that from you. And if you lose it, that's okay. You'll want what you have. Keep just wanting what you have. One of the things that I see a lot of times with our clients is that they can be insatiable. That whenever they get something, they want the next thing. And that level of desire is a pit that never gets filled. And the only way to stop that, it's not getting more things. You're not going to buy your way out of that pit. You have to live your way out of that pit. The other thing that we see, or the things that we often see with people, is that they tell themselves they're either afraid or they're overly confident. It's oftentimes one of those two things. And one of the things that we want to explore is either of those feelings, are they actually real? When you're afraid, is that actually a real thing? Or is it your imagination taking place? And one of the things that we do for that, there's a woman named Byron Katie, and she came up with this thing to kind of explore, you know her. And I love what she says. She says, first ask, is it true? Then ask, can you absolutely know it's true? 3, how do you react when you believe that thought? And 4, who would you be without that thought? And that can happen on a small scale, it can happen on a big scale. So if Bridget says to me, Bridget's gonna love this. If she says to me, can you unload the dishwasher? And my thought is, gosh, Bridget's controlling, okay? I have to ask myself, is that true? No, maybe she just wants me to unload the dishwasher. That's all she asked. My narrative then suddenly became she's controlling. So then I say to myself, okay, how do I react when I believe that thought, well, I get mad. I'm annoyed that suddenly Bridget's taking control over me. Who would I be without that thought? Well, I would unload the dishwasher and I'd be a loving husband. So why do I get spun around in that kind of cycle? And then if I turn it around, maybe I'm the one that's controlling. Maybe what's really annoying is that Bridget asked me to do something and I don't want to be asked to do something. Maybe that's my own sense of control that's the problem. Well, think about that. We had one of our clients who was helping her adult daughter. Her adult daughter was in her 30s, and she was the daughter had a graduate degree and never really found her footing. Just didn't know necessarily could not find where she was going to be in life. And so she kept on giving this daughter money, and then she kept on resenting the daughter for taking it. So it's kind of a weird thing to do, isn't it? You give something to someone, and then you resent them for what you offered them. And so we kind of went through it, and I said to her, okay, why are you giving your daughter money? Well, she can't make it on her own. And so I said, is that true? Well, she said, well, she's, keeps coming back for money. I said, but is it true? Do you know that she can't make it on her own? She goes, no, I don't know. I've never experimented with that. And what would change if this wasn't true? Well, I'd have a better relationship with my daughter. So we worked out a program to get her to gradually stop helping her daughter. And this daughter who never had a job, and again, this is anecdotal, it's one incident, small data set, but this daughter who never had a job found work, and now she ended up moving up into management in this company that she's working for and absolutely loves it. And the mother and the daughter have a completely different relationship. We think a lot of times that supporting our kids is a way to connect them to us, and sometimes it's just the opposite. Sometimes we need to do it, but again, explore your premise, and if it's really true, and if it isn't true, then do something different. What do others tell us? This is one of the things that I think is one of our biggest challenges, because I think what others tell us is that what I have is who I am. And a lot of times we need to show who we are. We need to signal. We need to do something to imply who we are. When I was chair of the board at the University of Minnesota Foundation, I would consciously think about what was I going to wear to that meeting? What was the kind of impression that I wanted to give? I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, I was an adult male who was chair of the board, and I was still insecure enough to say, oh my God, I think I have to wear this instead of this. Okay, I mean, that's silly. Why did I get tangled up like that? What was in me that made me do that? Well, because I got caught up with that stuff. But the funny thing about money is wealth is always what you don't see. And if you think about it, if you see someone pulling up in a $100,000 car, all you know is that they have a $100,000 car. You don't know if they took out a mortgage for it. You don't know if they paid cash. What you know is that they have $100,000 less than what they had before they bought that car. But that's not wealth. Wealth is invisible. And sometimes we get caught up thinking that we need to show this or show that or success, or someone is successful. I get that all the time. Clients will always say, why can my neighbor do this and I can't do this? Well, we don't know what's going on with the neighbor's situation. We don't know if the neighbor's in debt up to their heel. We don't know anything about it. And why does that really matter? We live in a relative society, and as a result, if the neighbors buy a Mercedes, we're less comfortable with our, Nissan. But why? Why is that? And I think that that's one of the things that gets in the way of spending our life wisely. Another thing we keep hearing is this is what you should do. So if you read the pundits, if you listen to me, or if you read the pundits, well, I'll tell you what you should do. Well, none of us know what you should do. Everything is based on the law of large numbers. You're one. You're one person. Okay, so what you should do, someone has to really understand you in order to know what you should do. We've had clients have had complicated tax things done for them. There's a thing called a cupert where you give your residence to a kid 10 years later. You live in it for 10 years, and then after 10 years, the kid inherits it, free of estate tax. It's a great tax trick, except after 10 years, you're renting it from the kid. Well, one of our clients had done that when they came to us. 10 years later, they're not talking to their kid. They have to rent the house from this estranged child. Great tax strategy, terrible life strategy. Don't be looking always for the angles. Keep coming back to what's the most important thing to you. We are terrible predictors of what's going to make us happy. All of us, none of us are very good at predicting that. And so what I encourage you to do is stay curious and be open to change. Bridget and I remember we bought a house, and we were in the house, and we realized it was the wrong neighborhood for us. It was just the wrong place for us. We were uncomfortable with where we were. And we have these rules, you have to hold your house for X amount of years, you have to do this or you have to do that. And Bridget and I were just going for a walk around the neighborhood, and she said, gosh, I just don't like this. I just can't stay here. And I said, well, let's sell it. And we'd only been there a year maybe at the time. And she said, can we? And I said, yeah, we can, of course we can sell it. We may lose a little bit of money, but that's a sacrifice that we have to make because we're going to be spending every day here for the next however many years, which, what do we want to do that's going to be more productive? And so sometimes we make these decisions that we view as irreversible when they're actually reversible. And if something can be reversed, consider doing that if you know it's the wrong decision. Almost no decision is right or wrong. Almost every decision is just more good than bad or more bad than good. So sometimes we're so critical of ourselves when we really don't need to be. The last thing I just want to say about what others tell us is I think there's something in the Tao Te Ching which I think is really something to hold close to your heart. In dwelling, live close to the ground. In thinking, keep to the simple. In conflict, be fair and generous. In governing, don't try to control. In work, do what you enjoy. In family life, be completely present. When you are content to be simply yourself and don't compare or compete, everybody will respect you. We often do the opposite, but I think that's great wisdom. What's money's proper place? Well, money, I gave you this thing on the charitable mission statement if you took it. And the reason I gave that out is it's kind of a way to explore where charity might fit in your life. But what I like about it more than anything, regardless of whether it's for charity or not, is it asks a bunch of provocative questions. And so many of us rush to answers before we understand what the questions are. And so I think regardless of where you're at from a charity standpoint, by asking yourself important questions, you'll start to get clarity. And so some of the things, that we like to kind of consider is, if money was no object, what would you do differently? How do you spend your money in ways that match your priorities? One of the things that, even in the company, this is one of the things that we talk about in the company, is if we make a mistake that we have to fix, we don't look at how much it costs to fix it. Our question always is, if this cost $1, would we fix it? Because once you start to attach money to these different things, it changes what your thinking is. You give yourself permission to think in ways that I think are unhealthy. What else can you learn from a charitable mission statement? I think you can learn what I feel by doing something like this. You can learn you have enough. Bridget and I, when we were in our 20s, we both put ourselves through college, and so we didn't have much money. We had a little bit of debt. When we graduated, I was first generation college, Bridget wasn't, but so we really didn't have anything. But in our 20s, we made a commitment that we were going to give 10% of our income to charity, well before we had much discretionary income. What that did for us was it made us realize that we were okay. It changed the context from, boy, we're broke, which we kind of were, to we are okay. So charity helps us realize we have enough. It helps us, as John read from my article, it helps us recognize that we've benefited from the good work of others. One of the things that I keep paying attention to, and I think about our company, when Will and I started our company back in 1987, it was the two of us, And if Bridget and Will's wife weren't working, we would never have made it. For 7 years, our secretary probably made more money than we did until things eventually worked out. But during all that time, there were so many people who had an influence over us, and at the university, there were so many people who had an influence over me, that for me not to try to repay that seems sort of ridiculous. And I think the other thing that I would say that giving to charity teaches us is a little bit of humility. And one of the things that I believe around money is that ego is the enemy. And by trying to recognize that there's others who don't have what we have, regardless of how little or how much we have, it gives us a little sense of humility. The other thing I think about money that I really believe is important is regret. And there was a great quote by this author named Sidney Harris. He was a journalist, and he wrote, "Regret for the things we did can be tempered by time. Regret for the things we did not do is inconsolable." And when you look back over your lives, think about the things that you wish you could have done differently. And now look forward and say to yourself, what are the things that I can be doing differently? Because again, we don't know when this transition is going to occur. We only know that it will. I think it's really important to close loops at this stage, and that's any kind of loop that you have. And the reason you want to do that is that it kind of creates a sense of personal resilience. And then one of our clients retired, and he was a executive of a big nonprofit. And he said, "I don't know what I'm going to do my first few months of retirement. I haven't really thought about it." And I encouraged him to write a thank you note to every person that he could think of, one a day, who had an influence in his life. And so he sat down and he took that to heart, and he wrote a note for the first 3 months or 6 months. I can't remember how long he did it. But he said it just changed everything for him. He would write a note to someone he hadn't seen in 20 years who suddenly reached out and said, let's get together for lunch. He just showed a level of gratitude that actually created a way for his retirement to move forward in a way that he had never even pictured. And I remember, I was national president of the Financial Planners Organization many, many years ago. And I remember my very first meeting when I was on that board. I was kind of the young person on the board. I was the start of the young people that, everyone was about 35 or 40 years older than me. And this was a guy from South Carolina. He was a gruff, tough guy. And we were supposed to be quiet in our first board meetings, but I must not have got that memo. And so I kept on asking questions and stuff like that. And I remember he just kept looking at me like more and more annoyed. And I got back to my office after that meeting. I flew back to Minneapolis, and I got back to my office. And a couple days later, there was a note from him. And that note, all it said was, "Someday you'll lead this organization." And I kept that note on my desk, and I kept it right on my computer until I ended up leading that organization. But that little thing that he did for me changed probably my whole perspective on everything. And that's one of the things that I try to do all the time. In fact, that's one of the things that we've passed on to our children, because one of the athletic director was able to get our daughter tickets for a basketball game that she paid for. It wasn't free, but and she wrote a big thank you note with a picture of her and her friend at the game. And I was at a meeting, and the athletic director led with that thank you note. This is the athletic director at University of Minnesota. He said almost all he hears about is what he's doing wrong, and he got this thank you note. I mean, this athletic director's 50, our daughter's 30, and it totally changed his perspective or attitude for that day. I mean, just think how little things can make such a big difference. I think the other thing, again, this is more than money, but this is sort of how think about life. And again, this is from 40 years of doing this with clients. Say the unsaid when you guys are going through transitions. But when you know someone who goes through a transition, I was talking to one of our clients' kids whose father died when he was 60, and the kid was maybe 25 at that time. And I was talking to him, I said, what was the hardest thing about your father dying? And he said, no one would talk to me about it. Everyone was afraid to ask me how I'm doing. Everyone was afraid to get into conversation. They sent, wishes, prayers and those kind of cards, but no one sat down and talked to me about it. It was one of the loneliest times of my life. I've got another friend who just had a stroke. He's 75 years old, lost the whole right side of his body, and I went to visit him, and we were talking about he and his partner, because he couldn't fully communicate, and I would ask her questions, and the light was going off, but we were just talking about what it's like for him and how he's handling that, and what are his hopes and what's he afraid of, and all those kind of conversations. And she said, we've had a lot of visitors here, and she said, no one's asked us those questions. But what are the things that you'd want to talk about? Give people permission to say, I don't want to talk about it, instead of making it about you and being uncomfortable with it. Let them be the judge of whether you want to talk about it or not. And the other thing I want to say is be intentional. Money's got a hold over us because money can represent power, and we think that it represents relationships. One of our clients, in order to bring their daughters closer together, bought them a cabin. The worst idea in the world. I mean, I always say that if you were not going to buy a cabin with your sibling, don't inherit it. But he bought the cabin. The two daughters are not talking to each other now. Huge blow up around that, and he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand why. Well, we were discouraging it from the front end, but he knew that this was going to bring them closer together. But money creates all these power dynamics that are really uncomfortable, and suddenly everything bubbles to the surface that didn't need to. That's why you really have to have, if you're thinking about doing anything for your children or anything like that, you have to have family meetings. You have to talk about it. You can't, it's not fair to leave things for the kids to work out when you're gone. It's just the wrong thing to do. I've got another client that they have a cabin up in Lake of the Woods, and they know that the son and the daughter, the son's going to want to be involved in the cabin, and the daughter's not going to want to be left out. And I said, let's have a meeting about it. Well, they don't want to because it's going to create conflict. So think what you're leaving for your children. You may not be there, but your legacy is going to live on, and is that the legacy you want to leave? The other thing I think about money, one of the things especially for couples, say yes sooner. One of the things I've learned over all these years is that, if Bridget and I want to do something, and I know I'm eventually going to concede, say yes more quickly. I don't know why I automatically object. It's just this kind of natural thing. It's like, I don't know if I want to punish. I don't know what I want to do. But what I've learned in our marriage is if I say yes quicker, it makes it better all the way around. If you're not going to say yes, don't say yes. But if you know you're going to say yes, just do it. Don't use money as your, don't try to get control through that way. And the other thing I'll say is that even when you disagree about money, move toward each other before you move away from each other. So the hardest thing that we have is when, for example, one client, if one spouse is really scared about money and the other spouse then gets really brave. Well, the spouse that's scared never feels heard then. And they actually get more and more afraid because no one's in their corner listening to them. You got to move toward the person before you move away. And I think that it is really important for relationships to think about that. So I'm going to give you 5 quick action steps before I close here. 1, remember you're only going to give your money away or spend it. Remember that. If you don't remember anything else, that's all you got. You're going to give it away or spend it. So the first thing I would encourage you to do is keep a 3-week journal and write down each time you have a money trigger. So you know food journals, if you're going to try to lose weight, well, each time you get a little ping about money, just write down what caused that ping and then explore that. Spend some time looking at that. And if you're partnered, sit down with your partner and go through that. You'll be surprised at what some of those triggers were. Second, if you're going to make a big purchase, 3-day rule. No impulse purchases on big purchases. Big purchases can be whatever dollar amount you decide, but always spend 3 days to kind of contemplate it. You'll be surprised at how many times you don't end up buying something. Third thing, look at your charitable mission statement. Even if you're not going to give a nickel to charity, figure out why you're not. Work on your charitable mission statement as a way to kind of explore your values. You're doing 4 different things through that. You know, you're understanding what your motives are, what your impact's going to be, what your values are. And so by doing that kind of thing, it will help you crystallize other aspects of your life. The 4th thing is, if you do have kids, have a family meeting. You don't need to share everything with them, but share some of the things that you want to share. There's a great thing that you can do that's called an ethical will, where you can write about what your values are rather than your valuables. We all know what wills are, but an ethical will helps you pass on what your values are. It shouldn't be prescriptive. It should be descriptive, kind of why you made different decisions in your life. But have a family meeting to talk with them. And then the 5th thing is go easy on yourself. View any money decision that you make as an experiment and then evaluate the results accordingly. Don't say, I did this wrong, I did this right, I should have bought Apple 30 years ago. Don't get into that place. Just view every money decision you made as an experiment and try to learn from it. Because the great thing about science is that math is absolutes. Science is always questioning, always learning, always trying to understand more. Well, money is science, it's not math, even though people only talk about it in the form of math. So with that, I just want to say that the last thing I want to read to you is about money and transitions, and it's from the Stoic Marcus Aurelius, and he said, objective judgment, now at this very moment, unselfish action, now at this very moment, willing acceptance, now at this very moment. That's all you need. And I really believe that. I appreciate your time, and I hope you all spend your life wisely. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Ross. Much to think about, and I want to let everyone know that this we taped this, and it'll be up on our website probably tomorrow. And so I know there were a lot of people that wanted to be here tonight that didn't get here, and so let them know it's there, along with all of our other presentations. And last thing, we don't take funding from the church for this, so there's a free will offering if you're so inclined. There'll be a couple baskets on your way out. And now John and I will field questions. We'll come to you if you got a question for Ross.
I never get questions when I talk about money. People, it's a subject that people won't talk about. Why don't let's go around the room and everyone stand up and tell me what number showed up on your tax return last year. Let's start with you. People don't do that, right?
No questions? Oh, there's one. All right. I'm coming to you.
You mentioned in some of your descriptions of, let's see, it was thriftiness versus frugality. Could you tell me a little more about the difference, thriftiness and frugality?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's open to interpretation, but the way I interpret it is thriftiness is being very aware of what you're spending your money on. Frugality is not being able to spend. So that I would say that that's the difference. So Chris Farrell wrote a book, The New Frugality, and he was using that as a positive, but it really isn't a positive. Being thrifty means that you're spending in alignment with your values. But we've got a lot of clients that are, I would call, frugal, where they don't want to spend money on anything. And the challenge with that is that there's the old saying in our business where if you don't fly first class, your kids will. But so the challenge with that is that if you're not really intentional about it, you won't enjoy life, and so you'll be saving too much money, and that's not necessarily a good thing. We're always trying to balance today with tomorrow. I mean, that's really what you're trying to find, equilibrium.
Hi, Ross. I've been so impressed with how you've, in your columns and in hearing you now, how you often incorporate philosophical and different spiritual values into how you advise people. So I just am curious to know if you just had to pick a few, what would be a few of your major philosophical or spiritual guides or learnings, teachings?
So that's really a great question. What are my philosophical teachings? So I've had a weird spiritual journey, I would call it. I was on the United Theological Seminary board with your previous minister, John Ross. But my sister, when I was a freshman in college, my sister died from a car accident. And I was 18, she was 26. And she was a Jehovah's Witness. And she died from a loss of blood. And her husband would not allow a blood transfusion. And that was just a terrible thing to experience. We weren't raised Jehovah's Witness. But what that did for me is it kind of said to myself, I'm really curious about religion. And I'm really curious about all religions, because whether you agreed with her or not, she believed in that so strongly that she was willing to die for it. Her husband, and I think her husband actually made a decision that would have been consistent with her. So I just started reading all sorts of stuff, and I'll read everything from the Stoics. I love Thomas Merton, who is, you love Thomas Merton. Anything that I read, I'm going to get something from. When I'm reading something, I'm not trying to figure out what's wrong with it. I'm trying to figure out what's right with it. And I think that attitude creates a level of curiosity and openness that really helps you kind of explore different things. But there's so many books. There's books on regret that I read. Anne Lamott I read. I mean, there's nothing that I won't pick up and look at. Anthony DeMello. I mean, there's some great people who've taught us a lot. So.
Speaking of books, we have a library section in our library here for next chapter. And it has a lot of thought-provoking things. On your way out, if you go in there and see a book, take it. When you're done, pass it along. Other questions? I guess you answered them all.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was nice to meet you. Bye-bye.
Please stop for refreshments on your way out. And there's a lot of them there, so go after them.